The morning I spotted deep scratches on my beach house lock. The porch smelled of salt and stale coffee, and the gulls were oddly quiet. I'm Rowan Greer, 57, retired internal auditor, still carrying the brass key my late wife once hung on a ribbon in the kitchen. Ever had one small detail, like that untouched key signal, a storm you didn't see coming? The morning air still clung to a faint chill as I walked up the narrow dune path, my sneakers dusted with sand. Wrightsville Beach was quiet this time of year, too early for tourists, too late for spring breakers. The gulls croaked above me as if to warn me of something I couldn't see. When I reached my front steps, the first thing I noticed was the lock. The brass keyhole, dulled with age, bore a fresh crescent scratch, thin but deep, like someone had been forcing a copy to turn. My pulse ticked faster than the tide behind me. A folded flyer flapped against the screen door, one corner trapped by the breeze. Confidential coastal listing, it read in glossy type. No address, no photo, just a phone number. I slid it into my jacket pocket, feeling the paper crinkle like a bad omen. I hadn't given permission for anyone to list this place. The beach house was mine-weathered cedar siding, uneven porch swing, every nail holding a memory. It had outlasted hurricanes, tax hikes, and my wife's long illness. No one was selling it out from under me. At least that's what I told myself as I scanned the street for a car I didn't recognize. Mira Holt. My neighbor 2 doors down leaned over her porch railing, a steaming mug in hand. "Rowan," she called softly, nodding toward my door. "I saw a black sedan out here late last night. Parked a while, lights off. Porch light of yours flicked on, then off." Her tone was casual, but her eyes lingered on the scratched brass. She didn't press, though Mira never did. "Coffee later, I've got that Colombian roast you like." "Maybe," I said, mustering a smile I didn't feel. Mira was kinda widow like me, but I wasn't in the mood to sip and chat. My head buzzed too loudly with questions. I turned the old brass key in the scarred lock. The tumbler caught for a second before giving way, like it too was reluctant to let me in. Inside, the house smelled faintly of salt pine and the ghost of grilled shrimp from summers past. Sunlight spilled through the shutters, catching on the worn pine floors. I paused in the center of the living room, fingers grazing the mantel, where my late wife's framed photo still stood, her laugh frozen mid-tilt, echoing in my mind. The porch swing creaked in the distance, a sound that always made me feel like time itself was breathing. A sharp ping yanked me from the memory. My phone buzzed with a new email. Subject line: finalizing draft contract. Please confirm by Monday. Sent to Van, my son. And by mistake or fate, CC'd to me. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen as a dozen possibilities unraveled in my mind. Van had charm to spare, but his financial discipline non-existent. The kind of man who could smile while explaining why his credit card debt was just a phase. The hum of the ocean outside blurred into white noise. As I closed the laptop I'd reflexively opened to double-check my email chain. My hand drifted to the brass key, still warm from my grip, the one thing in this house that felt steadfast. I turned it over in my palm, the edges biting slightly into my skin, and whispered to no one but the salt air. "So this is how it starts, huh?" The wind had shifted overnight, dragging the smell of rain in from the Atlantic. By mid-morning, gusts rattled the shutters, a steady tap-tap, like knuckles on a hollow door. I shuffled into the kitchen, still in my socks, and stopped cold. On the counter, under the edge of yesterday's paper, sat a crumpled invoice from the Homeowners Association. Van's name in bold, but my address printed neatly beneath. Dated last month. My fingers flattened the paper, tracing the faint watermark. The late fee warning circled in red ink. Proof as plain as the salt crust on the windows that someone had hitched my beach house to their wagon without so much as a phone call. On my desk in the corner, a stack of old 401k statements waited for me like a forgotten chore. The top folder gaped open, one page jutting out with Van's unmistakable scrawl, "Advance." His looping handwriting had always leaned a little to the right, like it was about to sprint off the page. I tucked the page back in, but left the folder ajar, a reminder that my son's ambitions had a way of crawling into places they didn't belong. The house creaked as another gust swept through. I stood by the window, watching the frothing ocean churn beyond the dunes, and thought about the summers that had stitched this place into our lives. Grilled corn cooling on the porch railing, my late wife laughing as Van, 10 years old and sunburned, tried to outbuild me in sandcastle wars. The scent of charcoal and sunscreen had been our signature then. Now the air smelled only of cold brine and the faint metallic bite of the storm. A knock interrupted my drift. Mira Holt stood on the porch bundled in a knitted scarf, holding a casserole dish that sent curls of steam into the chilled air. "Figured you could use something warm," she said, stepping inside as I waved her in. The smell of roasted chicken and thyme cut through the dampness. She set the dish on the counter, her eyes sliding to the crumpled invoice I'd failed to hide. She didn't ask, just mentioned casually saw Van driving a new Lexus yesterday. Deep blue, the kind with those LED lights that make it look like a spaceship. Surprised me considering, well, she let the words trail off, replaced by the rattle of wind against the siding. I mumbled a thank you, keeping my face still. Mira had a talent for making observations sound like weather reports, neutral, but impossible to ignore. After she left, the house felt heavier, like the walls themselves had picked up her unspoken question. Later that afternoon, I took my usual walk along the deserted stretch of beach. The sand was firm from the tide, the air cold enough to sting my ears. As I rounded the path back toward the road, I spotted Van's Lexus pulling away from the shoulder by my mailbox. The tinted windows hid his face, but I recognized the license plate from a distance. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and chose not to. By the time I climbed the porch steps, my resolve had settled like sediment in a glass of water. I powered up my laptop and opened my email. At the top sat a draft listing agreement naming my house, complete with a preliminary price tag and closing date, no signature line filled in by me. My thumb hovered over the trackpad, heat prickling behind my ears. I clicked it open, reading every clause, each one tugging another knot into my gut. I began typing a reply. "Let's discuss over coffee before I sign anything." I stared at the blinking cursor, the draft unsent, and closed the lid of the laptop with a quiet thud. The wind outside howled through the eaves as if daring me to act. For now, I let the email sit like a held breath, knowing that whatever came next would decide whether this house stayed mine or became another of Van's gambles. The neon driftwood sign outside the diner sputtered, the D flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay lit or quit altogether. I paused under its pale blue glow, hearing the hum and pop with each pulse, before pushing the heavy glass door open. The smell of sizzling bacon and burnt coffee hit me in a wave, grounding me in a place where everything felt sticky with familiarity. Vinyl boots chatter about hurricane forecasts. The faint clink of forks against chipped plates. Harlan Doyle was already there, tucked into the far booth, his bulk angled toward the window, as if keeping an eye on the parking lot. 64, now retired from the same firm I'd left a year earlier, he still carried himself like an auditor, shoulders stiff, eyes scanning, hands folded on the table like a ledger ready to be opened. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and slid a worn business card across the table. Its corners were softened by years of being handed around. "Local real estate attorney," he said. Voice low. "Knows the waters better than most." The neon buzzed again overhead, its glow tinting Harlan's face, a faint electric blue. I took the card and turned it over in my hand, the lettering slightly faded. My mind ticked through the invoices, the erased figures on the tax bill, the unsigned listing agreement. Harlan didn't rush me. He just waved at Clarice, the waitress, who dropped 2 steaming mugs of coffee onto the table, and left a folded receipt behind, today's date printed in bold across the top. I tucked it into my pocket, another timestamp for the growing file. "You don't go straight at Van," Harlan finally said, stirring sugar into his coffee without looking at me. "He's your son, sure, but he's also building something behind your back. Confront him now, he'll bolt or bury the trail. What you need is leverage, screenshots, time-stamped emails, paper he can't argue with." I sipped the bitter brew, letting the heat settle my nerves. The diner's hum softened as my thoughts narrowed to the pattern Harlan was sketching. Screenshots, copies, a timeline so airtight, even a fast-talking realtor couldn't pry it open. "And if he pushes to close before I'm ready?" I asked. Harlan leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the smell of bacon grease clinging to his jacket. Rowan, you've always been the quiet type. Use that. Pretend you're on his side. Ask questions, nod along, whatever it takes. But make sure the paperwork sings your tune before anyone puts ink on a page. For a long moment, we sat in the low hum of the diner, the neon outside flickering in time with the ceiling fan's wobble. Clarice refilled our mugs without a word, her bracelet jingling faintly as she set them down. I traced the edge of the lawyer's card, feeling the embossed letters catch against my thumb. The voices of locals grumbling about shrimp prices, laughing about last season's storms, faded to a murmur behind the thickening outline of a plan in my head. I slipped the card into my wallet, nodding once to Harland. The clatter of plates and the buzz of the neon sign seemed to recede as I stood the first threads of a strategy pulling taut. As the door swung shut behind me, the humid summer air wrapped around me sticky and heavy, and I stared at the card again beneath the sputtering glow of the sign. The plan wasn't whole yet, but for the first time in months, it felt like the tide might turn in my favor. The wind off the Atlantic pushed against the porch screens, making them thrum like a distant drum. Wrightsville Beach was quiet in late autumn. Most of the vacation homes shuttered the streets lined with sandbags and tied down furniture in case another storm swept through. I stood on the porch, mug in hand, the chipped edge pressed lightly to my lip, while Van paced in front of me like a salesman late on a quota. His voice kept rising and falling with the gusts, as if the weather itself was backing him up. "Dad, we can't drag this out," he said, gesturing toward the house like it was some stubborn old mule. "The maintenance agreements are standard, sign them, and we'll both stop bleeding cash. You're not even here half the time." I traced the rim of my mug, feeling the rough notch in the ceramic. My favorite one, a hand-me-down from the diner, where Harland and I had first planned my quiet little countermove. I'd held on to it like a talisman, something solid in a year, where everything felt slippery. Mira had stopped by earlier, setting a steaming cup of ginger tea on the railing and glancing at Van with that tight-lipped neighborly concern. She'd sensed the tension but said nothing, retreating as fast as she'd come. "Funny," I said, leaning back against the porch post, "how these agreements never mention the draft listing I keep seeing in my inbox. Maybe you can explain that to me before I put my name on anything." Van's smile twitched just enough to betray the edge beneath. "That's just a placeholder, nothing official. You know how realtors work, always fishing." He waved a hand like he was brushing away a cobweb, his new watch flashing in the gray light. I let the silence stretch, the wind scraping the porch rail with a low moan. My fingers slipped on the handle, slick with condensation, and before I could grip it tighter, the mug slid from my hand. It hit the wooden floorboards with a sharp crack, breaking clean in two. Both of us froze, watching steam curl from the splintered ceramic halves. For a second, it was as if the whole house had inhaled, holding its breath along with us. Van crouched, picking up one half, then handed it to me wordlessly. "Accidents happen," he muttered, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes. I turned the piece over in my palm, the chipped edge catching on my skin. Inside, a decision settled like the cool wind rolling off the ocean. I wasn't just watching anymore. I'd play the dutiful father, the agreeable retiree, but the trap was already baited. On my fridge, a yellow sticky note waited under the dim kitchen bulb, the ink a calm reminder. 10:15 p.m., auto-send. Tonight, the attorney would get the full draft contract, the invoices, the time-stamped receipts. No more shadows, no more guessing. Van straightened, adjusting his coat as the wind tugged at his sleeves. "By Christmas," he said almost to himself, "this place will finally make us some real money." I bent to gather the other half of the mug, the porch boards cold under my knees. Holding both pieces together, I felt the seam jagged and imperfect pressing into my fingers. "Not if I can help it," I murmured so low the wind nearly stole the words. Inside, through the open doorway, the sticky note on the fridge caught the weak light, its corner curling slightly with the draft. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet as Van's car door slammed and his tires crunched down the gravel drive, leaving me on the porch with a broken cup and a plan about to click into place. The porch light stuttered in the playback, its glow blooming and shrinking, as if it too were nervous about what it was watching. I sat at my desk just after dawn, the blinds half closed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, and the faint scent of jasmine from the open window drifting through the room. On the laptop screen, Van appeared in grainy black and white, shoulders hunched, slipping a thick envelope into the mailbox as he glanced over both shoulders. His new sneakers left clean arcs in the sand on the path, and the faint motion sensor chime pinged once, breaking the early silence. I didn't replay it for drama. I replayed it to note the timestamp, 4:22 a.m., and the faint reflection in the window behind him, a figure he likely didn't realize he'd caught himself pausing to scan the street. My thumb clicked the download icon. The file zipped itself into my external drive, the soft snap of the cap on the thumb drive sounding far louder than it should have in the morning stillness. The pieces were falling into place like I'd been laying tracks for years. On the desk beside the laptop, a crumpled contractor's receipt lay half hidden under an old notepad. The handwriting unmistakably Vans had scrawled "Advance," due upon sale in the margin, the ink slightly smudged where a damp fingerprint had blurred the A. It wasn't evidence yet, not by itself, but it painted the intent clearly enough for anyone willing to connect the dots. And Harlan's words, growled over the phone the night before, echoed in my ears. Get the contract, not just the whispers. Proof is power. Everything else is noise. The warm spring breeze ruffled the papers on my desk, carrying the faint tang of salt and something sweeter, jasmine, wafting in from Mira's yard next door. My phone buzzed on the armrest of my chair, my attorney confirming receipt of the draft listing agreement I'd had set to auto-send at precisely 10:15 p.m. the night before. He forged your signature on a co-owner authorization. The message read, blunt as a hammer. We can act now. I locked my jaw, letting the words settle. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was theft, plain and documented. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a beat, as the ceiling fan's hum filled the pause. The cracked mug pieces sat in the desk drawer beneath my hand, smooth and cool against my fingertips. I didn't know why I kept them, maybe as a reminder that even broken things could be held together long enough to serve their purpose. I opened the porch camera clip again, watching Van's uneasy glance toward the street, the way he shook his hands out before leaving, as if shedding nerves. Gotcha, I murmured, my voice barely above the wind rattling the window frame. A vibration from my phone broke the quiet. Harlan's text, brief as always, meet me tomorrow. We'll make sure he hangs himself with his own rope. Beyond the windows, clouds were gathering low and swollen, their edges tinged with the faint red of early morning light. A storm was rolling, in the kind that scours the air clean and leaves everything smelling of sea and rain. I slipped the thumb drive into my shirt pocket and slid the two halves of the broken mug in beside it, their edges cushioned by a folded handkerchief. One more crack to mend, I thought, as the first distant rumble of thunder reached the shore. And soon the cracks wouldn't be mine to carry anymore. The blinds cast sharp, even stripes of sunlight across the conference table, cutting through the faint haze of copier toner and the steady hum of the air conditioning. I sat with my hands flat on the cool wood surface, my posture measured, eyes on the grain of the table, as Van leaned back in his chair across from me. He had his easy grin on, the same one that had talked his way out of overdue credit cards and into more than one ill-fated investment opportunity. But his knee bounced under the table, the only giveaway he hadn't thought this through. Beside me, Lydia Pike adjusted her glasses, the stack of documents in front of her, perfectly aligned. Her voice, calm and clipped, broke the silence. Van, before we discuss any sale, I want to address this. She slid a single sheet across the table. The forged co-owner authorization letter, my name signed in a hand I'd never write with. She placed the porch camera clip on top her laptop, angled so the frozen frame showed Van slipping that envelope into my mailbox. No theatrics, just evidence, clinical and undeniable. The grin faltered. Van's hand went to his collar, tugging slightly, as if the temperature had climbed 10 degrees. I had no choice, he muttered, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. There's a loan shark, Juno's guy in Charlotte. If I didn't put something up, they were going to take the Lexus, my accounts, everything. I figured I could flip the house fast, and his words stumbled over themselves, the charm fraying into something raw and desperate. For a moment, I saw not a schemer, but a cornered man, balancing on a crumbling ledge. I felt the small roll of gold repair tape in my pocket shift as I shifted in my chair, the thin metallic edge cool against my fingertips. It wasn't for now, not yet. Lydia spoke again, crisp as the snap of a file folder. Your choices are straightforward. Withdraw every listing and any pending contracts immediately or face charges for fraud and forgery. There's no middle ground legally. Her tone carried no judgment, only certainty, and it left the room quieter than the hum of the air vent. Van's eyes flicked to mine, searching for a soft landing. He didn't find one, but he didn't find fire either. There's another way, I said, finally leaning forward just enough that my words didn't have to be sharp to be heard. I'll cover a portion of your debt. Not all enough to get those people off your back. But the house stays in my name, and I'm moving it into a community trust. No more leverage, no more secret contracts. It'll be here for the family and for others long after either of us needs it. His jaw tightened. I could see the math playing out in his head, the bruised ego, the debt collectors, the slow realization he was out of exits. His shoulders sagged, the last bit of fight leaking out as Lydia slid the agreement forward. He signed in 3 deliberate strokes, each louder than the one before, the pen scratch filling the still air. I exhaled quietly, not in triumph, but in something closer to relief. My thumb brushed the gold tape again, its glint catching a stray sliver of sunlight filtering through the blinds. Harlan, leaning against the back wall like he had all the time in the world, tilted his head slightly, the closest he came to a nod. As Van slid the papers back, avoiding my eyes, I pressed the 2 halves of the cracked mug together inside my pocket. The pieces fit cleanly, as if they'd been waiting for the right pressure to hold them. Time to mend more than just porcelain, I whispered to Harlan, just loud enough for him to hear. The copier down the hall clicked on, spitting out a test page that echoed faintly into the stillness, a mundane sound that somehow felt like a full stop. Outside, the July heat shimmered off the pavement, but in here, the air felt lighter, not clear, not yet, but lighter. The morning light came soft and angled through the kitchen windows, painting the cedar beams in warm, muted gold. The beach beyond the porch was alive again, gulls diving, children chasing foam along the tide line. The faint murmur of laughter carried by the breeze. On the worn oak counter, the mug I'd kept tucked away for 2 years sat waiting, its once broken halves, now bound by a final strip of thin gold tape. My fingers smoothed the seam carefully, the adhesive warm from the sunbeam streaking across the counter. Beneath the mug, a single folded flyer peeked out, its bright headline reading Coastal Community Workshop Skills Stories and Shorelines. I hadn't meant to leave it there, but maybe that was fitting. The house, no longer just mine, no longer a bargaining chip in someone else's desperate gamble, had been reborn as something more stable, more useful. Its rental income funded these gatherings. Now retirees teaching woodworking teens, learning to repair fishing nets. Mira showing locals how to coax stubborn herbs from sandy soil. Out on the porch, Van balanced on a step stool, repainting the weathered shutters, a deep slate blue. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady. Not the rushed strokes of a man trying to get through a chore, but the measured work of someone trying to steady his hands, maybe even his life. He hadn't said much all morning, but when I stepped outside with the repaired mug in hand, he glanced down and said, I can help with the trust bookkeeping if you want. I've been keeping myself straight this past year. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, but it didn't shake. Mira, kneeling in the flower bed by the porch, smirked over her shoulder without looking up from her trowel. Give him a clean slate, Rowan, she said, patting the soil firm around a young lavender plant. Just like that mug of yours, gold seams and all. Inside, Harlan leaned against the doorframe, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, the other tucked in his pocket. He hadn't said much either, just watched that wry twist of a smile ghosting across his face as if to say, Didn't think you had it in you, did you? His presence was grounding, the kind of silent nod that let me know the ground we'd fought to hold was steady, at least for now. Steam curled up from the kettle on the stove. I poured slowly the tea, filling the mug, and for a moment I half expected a leak to betray my amateur repair. But the seam held gleaming faintly in the light. The mug warmed in my hand, the faint scent of jasmine tea rising like a whisper of the first days I'd spent here. Before the storms, literal and otherwise. I stepped back onto the porch, raising the mug toward Harlan, who lingered in the doorway. One more seam held. I said the T, catching a glint of sun as the gulls cried overhead. My gaze drifted to Van. Still painting, still quiet. Now I added softly, tilting the mug. Just slightly. Let's see if it lasts. The breeze shifted, bringing the distant sound of voices workshop volunteers, arriving early, their chatter drifting up the boardwalk. The mug's gold seam glinted again in the light, a line both fragile and strong as the porch swing creaked behind me. The porch light stuttered twice as dusk crept across Wrightsville Beach, the faint pulse of yellow casting long, soft shadows over the cedar boards. The flicker felt familiar, a whisper from that night years ago, when Mira had leaned over my fence, warning me about a sleek car idling by my steps. Back then, the light's unsteady glow made my stomach churn with unease. Tonight it was just a memory, swallowed by the hum of conversation and the smell of hickory smoke rolling off the grill. Inside, taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet, the smiling face of my late wife greeted me as it had for decades, a faded Polaroid from one summer when she and I stood laughing, sleeves rolled up elbow deep in a bowl of coleslaw for a neighborhood potluck. The picture was curling at the edges now, but every time I opened that cabinet, I was reminded why this house wasn't just property. It was a hinge between what was and what still could be. The front yard buzzed with voices. Retirees who had attended woodworking classes here waved spatulas, turning skewers of vegetables over the coals. Teens from the net repair workshops passed out paper plates, while Mira moved between tables with the kind of easy grace only she could muster. Her voice rising above the chatter to call for seconds of her peach cobbler. Near the grill, Van stood in a faded ball cap, flipping burgers with careful attention as if each patty deserved an even sear. His shoulders, once tight with restless energy, looked looser now. He caught my eye, held it for a moment, and nodded slightly before holding out a folded packet. "Draft for a workshop," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Retiree skills, bookkeeping, basic computer stuff, even some of the auditing tricks you used to tell me about." I thought, maybe we could co-run it. Give back, you know. His voice was steady, a far cry from the slippery apologies of those earlier years. I took the packet but didn't open it right away. Instead, I walked to the porch, where a small glass display case sat against the wall. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was the old brass key, the same one that had turned in this house's lock for 40 years. Its surface had dulled with time, but the weight of it hadn't changed. I set the case on a shelf by the porch railing where guests could see it as they came and went, a quiet reminder of what we'd almost lost and what we'd decided to protect. The evening deepened music, rising from a portable speaker someone had propped near the steps. Harlan leaned against a post, his sweet tea sweating in the heat, his expression more relaxed than I'd seen it in years. He didn't say much, just lifted his glass slightly when our eyes met, as if toasting the quiet victories no one else noticed. Laughter and the scent of sizzling meat swirled together, mingling with the faint cries of gulls drifting toward their roosts. I lingered at the threshold as the last rays of sun softened to blue, feeling the weight of the house settle not on my shoulders, but around me as something shared. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden or a battlefield. It felt like a place meant to outlive me. I reached up and tapped the porch light once. It flickered again, then steadied, casting a calm, even glow across the yard. The conversations outside continued warm and unhurried as I stepped inside and closed the door for the night. The last of the daylight slipped across the porch, catching the gold seam on my repaired mug as the scent of peach cobbler drifted from Mira's table. I thought about how close this place came to being sold off and how somehow it ended up fuller than before, hosting neighbors' laughter and even my son's steadier now. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. The trick is deciding who gets to cross them with us. For anyone weathering a betrayal or a hard season, know that even cracks, literal or not, can be mended into something stronger. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, or even see you join our little channel for more tales like this.